My name is Robert Trent Benson. I am the director and chair of the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at University of Virginia in the US. And I also have the great pleasure of being the president of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, otherwise known as ASWAD. It is my great pleasure to be the chair of this panel of wonderful scholars. We're building on our keynote address earlier this morning from Mahmoud Mamdani. And this particular panel takes up the themes that were discussed this morning. We will, in this panel, talk through these dynamics, the applicability, the utility, and the definitions of the modern European categories of religion and democracy on the African continent. Those ideas have been hotly contested and debated for centuries, as we know. And in this particular session, the panelists will trace the historical formations of these categories and their relationship to each other across different domains in various African societies and polities, providing foundational context for the rest of the conversations in this conference, which is again titled Religion and Democracy on the African Continent, Colonial Legacies and Post-Colonial Possibilities. So let me very quickly at the outset just talk through the format for this particular panel. Each panelist will deliver a 10-minute presentation, followed by a 5-minute Q&A specifically on that presentation. Then we'll move to the next panelist, which will also continue with a 10-minute presentation, followed by a 5-minute Q&A, and on and on and on. We'll take a break after the third panelist, Professor Obadare. We'll take a 10-minute break halfway through the session, and then we'll come back together to begin with the fourth panelist, Professor Salem. Hopefully there'll be time at the very end so that we can have a general Q&A. Perhaps there will be an opportunity for the audience and perhaps panelists themselves to ask questions of each other, to seek the connections between the papers. And so at the outset, what I will do is I will introduce each panelist, and then I'll step aside and then we'll move through as each panelist will present their work, handle their Q&A, and then move to the next panelist. So our first presenter is Professor Rabia Akande. And Professor Akande works in the fields of legal history, law and religion, constitutional and comparative constitutional law, Islamic law, international law, and post-colonial African law and society at the Osgoode Hall Law School of York University in Toronto, Canada. There she is an assistant professor of law, and her current research explores struggles over religion, state relations, and comparative context, and illuminates law's centrality to one of modernity's most contested issues, the relationship between religion and the state and society, while also interrogating law's complex relationship with power, political theology, identity, and socio-political change. These issues are at the forefront of her book project, Constitutional Entanglements, Empire, Law, and Religion in Colonial Northern Nigeria, which is under contract with Cambridge University Press. And this book traces the emergence of secularism, in quotation marks, as a constitutional idea of ordering religion-state relations in early to mid 20th century British colonial Northern Nigeria, and it grapples with the post-colonial legacy of that inheritance. Welcome, Professor Akande. Our second presenter is Professor Abdul Basit Kasim. And Professor Kasim is a PhD candidate at the Department of Religion at Rice University and a visiting doctoral fellow at the Institute of Islamic Thought and Africa at Northwestern University. Professor Kasim, and I've already given you the title professor, I know you're a PhD candidate, but thinking ahead, has received the MA in Politics and International Relationships from Kiel University and his BSc in International Studies from Ahmadu Bello University in Nigeria. Professor Kasim's primary field of research is Islam and Africana Studies, with particular interest in African intellectual and religious history of classical and modern Islamic thought, slavery, and race in Africa and the African diaspora, African and African diaspora religions, Arabic, Ajami, codicology and textual anthropology, Africology and postcolonial studies, gender and sexuality, and in African Muslim societies and religion and international relations. Professor Abdul Basit's first book, The Boko Haram Reader, From Nigerian Preachers to the Islamic State, was published by Hearst and Oxford University Press and Reader Books in 2018. And this was co-edited with Michael Nwankpa, and it offers an unprecedented collection of primary source text, audiovisual, and nasheeds, or other words, martial hymns, translated into English from Hausa, Arabic, and Kanuri. And it traces the history and the evolution of the Boko Haram movement. And his second book, Boko Haram, The Past of the Present Upheaval, is under advanced contract. Welcome, Professor Obadare. Our third presenter, Professor Zakaria Ahmed Salem, is Associate Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University and Director of the Institute for the Study of Islamic Thought in Africa. Salem studies religion and politics with a special focus on Islam and Muslim politics in Africa and comparative perspective. He's empirically focused on Mauritania, a country straddling the Arab world in sub-Saharan Africa, and Salem's research explores in particular the interplay between inequality, Islamic knowledge, and power. His first monograph explores this theme through an examination of two parallel post-colonial developments: the push against the traditional forms of inequality such as slavery and social hierarchies on the one hand, and the Islamization of the Mauritanian public and political life on the other. Another ongoing project investigates how Balad Shink, today's Islamic Republic of Mauritania, has become in a little over a century a label of excellence and Islamic knowledge and normative authority with an astonishing global reach. Salem's other research interests and publications explore themes such as race and politics in Muslim societies, the politics of de-radicalization, and countering violent terrorism, or CVE, social movements and everyday negotiations over citizenship, biometrics, and politics. Our next presenter is Professor Alexander Thurston, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Cincinnati, where he works on Islam and politics in Northwest Africa with a focus on 20th and 21st centuries. He has conducted field research in Nigeria, Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, and Burkina Faso, and has authored several books, including Salafism in Nigeria, Islam Preaching in Politics, that was from Cambridge Press in 2016, Boko Haram, The History of an African Jihadist Movement from Princeton University Press in 2018, and Jihadists of North Africa and the Sahel, Local Politics and Rebel Groups, and that is from Cambridge in 2020. So that is the introduction of all of our panelists. You can see from their bios, their extensive bios, that they are quite distinguished and experts in what they do, and we look forward to hearing from them, and we will lead with Professor Akante. Take it away.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, and I'm really for inviting me to join this conversation. So my talk will center on the legal politics of religious difference in the last decade of colonial rule in Northern Nigeria, and specifically on what I describe as the construction of minorities and the consequences of that process for the distribution of rights and disabilities in the late colonial state and ultimately in the post-colonial. The last decade of British imperial dominion not only witnessed anticipated calls for independence from the British Empire, it also saw the emergence of self-determination demands for political autonomy of groups within the protectorate itself. Now, as described by the advocates of this self-determination project, that demand for autonomy was to take the form of the creation of a Middle Belt state within a federal Nigeria. And moreover, the group on whose behalf the claims for autonomy was being made, that is the group self, in international legal discourse parlance, were the religious minorities of the colony. Now, that period in Nigeria's constitutional history has received widespread attention. However, the tendency has been to center the claim for state creation itself, that is the claim for the creation of a Middle Belt state. What I want to do over the course of the next few minutes is to shift the focus from that state creation demand and to instead consider what we might learn about the constitutional politics of the late colonial state if we instead foreground the making of the religious minorities group, that is the group self on behalf of whom the self-determination advocates brought the state creation demand. So that shift from the state creation demand to examining the group on whose behalf the claim was brought eliminates the legal politics of religious difference and sameness in the late colonial state, and ultimately troubles the narratives of the emancipatory vision of that self-determination project, which in fact continues to be popular both in scholarship but also in public memory. So certainly it's clear that a range of power relations condition a group as a minority in any polity, yet the marshalling of a minority identity to make political and legal claims is far from an unmediated outcome of those background circumstances. Far from neutral, the construction of minorities often necessitates deliberate and inconscient choices of inclusion and exclusion, with consequences both for the shaping of that identity, but also for the substance of the claims to be made. The religious minorities identity that emerged in the late colonial state in northern Nigeria was in fact a product of the colonial state's binary distinction of subjects as either Muslims or non-Muslims, which was in fact the basis for the state's indirect rule design. So this is a crucial point to note because the religious minorities identity was ostensibly marshaled to resist colonial governance, yet it actually entailed embracing the colonial categories because it defined itself by reference to its non-Muslim nature. The colonial state glossed over complexities in pre-colonial identity formations to classify population as either Muslim or non-Muslim. And then the state-based residential formations, political administration, and ultimately jurisdiction of the law and courts on that distinction. It's also crucial to note that the Muslim, non-Muslim distinction was also the basis of the government's policy on Christian missionary activity. In fact, the overwhelmingly Protestant missions that were drawn to the northern Nigerian mission field were largely restricted to preaching to adherents of indigenous religions, which frustrated the missionary dreams of converting Muslim Africans. And so a binarized notion of religious difference based on this Muslim, non-Muslim distinction was central to how empire apprehended its colonial possession and to how it governed the colonial population. So by making this claim, I don't mean to state that in fact, religious difference was manufactured by the colonial state, because of course, religious difference predated the colonial encounter. Yet colonial governance came to define, deepen, and hierarchize religion and religious difference in historical ways. That governance project granted ceremonial deference to the colonial remains of the pre-colonial caliphal aristocracy as the ideal Muslims and violently repressed Muslim critics of the state's alliance with those elites. The governance project also manifested as the state's alteration of Islamic law and institutions, which I have spent some time describing in some of my other work. And finally, that process of redefining and ultimately transforming religion erased the diversity of pre-colonial indigenous religious populations and homogenized that identity as simply non-Muslim. The consequences of those processes was not only to transform religion, but also to set hierarchies and ultimately deepen religious difference. So the deeply unequal relations of power that was set in motion by colonial rule created a de facto minority status for Muslim critics of the state. It also created as a de facto minority indigenous religious populations and new converts to Christianity. Yet the construction of religious minorities to make self-determination claims in the last decade of colonial rule was far from a straightforward reflection of the complex forms of exclusion that colonial governance of religion entailed. Championed by local Protestant nationalists and with the undisputed influence of missionary advisors, the wielding of the religious minorities' identity for self-determination effectively sidelined non-Protestant concerns. Now, although the religious minority identity purported to be inclusive of all non-Muslim faiths, self-determination advocacy overwhelmingly privileged the Protestant experience. And in fact, the most bitter contestation in the late colonial years, just as in the earlier colonial years, was triggered by frustrations over the state's extreme restrictions on Christian missions, restrictions that had in fact long made colonial northern Nigeria particularly infamous in global missionary circles. That centering of the missionary experience in the narrative of non-Muslim marginalization had the unintended consequence of masking disabilities that colonial governance of religion had imposed on non-Protestant groups. Particularly noteworthy is the scant attention that the state's repression of non-Muslim indigenous groups received in Protestant advocacy for self-determination. So those groups were classified as, quote, pagan in colonial discourse and stripped of the jurisdictional autonomy that they had enjoyed even in times of the pre-colonial caliphate. And therefore, while the religious minorities identity formally included these indigenous religious groups, the relegation of their concerns questions their substantive representation. Perhaps even more troubling was the outright exclusion, both formally and substantively, of certain Muslim groups. So take the example of the Tijaniya Sufi group that had long been marginalized by the state in response to its criticism of the state's alliance with the tragic Muslim figures through whom the protectorate was governed. As constructed by Protestant nationalists and ultimately authorized by the state, the religious minorities' identity excluded those groups outrightly. In fact, when the Tijaniya sought to present grievances before the Sir Henry Willing Chaired Commission that the government had established to investigate the minority question in 1957, 1958, that commission barred the Tijaniya from appearing before it as other groups had done. The commission's rationale was peculiar, but it was also illuminating. It argued that as an intra-religious sect, the Tijaniya constituted a dissident group rather than an actual legal minority. Now, notice that by doing so, the colonial government was just like the Protestant advocates resisting the state, defining religious minorities to exclude groups who had perhaps suffered the most pervasive disabilities in the state. So I know I don't have much time. I'm just going to conclude with a few thoughts. The Protestant Championed Religious Minorities Project was conceived as the Colonial, an emancipatory project that would shatter the hierarchies that had been instantiated by colonial governance. Yet, the religious differentiation and homogenization processes that were integral to the making of that identity perpetuated the marginalization of insular groups. And even though the state creation demand had failed at independence, the making of the religious minorities' identity continued to be significant for constitutional politics. Specifically, in seeking to produce a subject that was worthy of seeking redress from the state, the religious minorities' identity succeeded in overturning rather than dismantling colonial hierarchies. And even as it sidelined indigenous religions and repressed Muslim minority concerns, the Protestant Championed Religious Minorities Group utilized the colonial Muslim versus non-Muslim binary as the basis for narrating the experience of disempowerment on which it grounded its claims. At the same time, however, that binary lens masked the ways through which the state's governance of all faiths had led to the radical transformation, not only of religious institutions, but also of notions of religious difference. The ultimate consequence was that a project that had been conceived as emancipatory not only embraced hierarchies, but also opened new doors to inequality. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Professor Akande, for your talk. Are there questions from the audience? Thank you so much for your talk. Any questions from the audience? And you can use the Q&A please use the Q&A function to ask questions that you have or offer comments, okay? Well, in this time that we have, as folk are thinking about their questions, I know you had to finish up your presentation. Are there parts of the presentation that you would, that you didn't have a chance to share that you would like to add now?
I mean, I think I'm just gonna, stop there right now. I mean, it's so this, really was it's a really like it's a very short form of a chapter in my book manuscript, in which I think seriously about that moment in the last years of colonial rule, when groups that had been marginalized by the state then approached the state, seeking, making different claims, and those claims typically centered on ideas of self-determination, and ideas of self-determination are centered on seeking political autonomy within the state itself. And what the state, what the colonial government did was to essentially, set up a commission to inquire into, I think I see a question.
Yes, there's a question from Professor Tayyip Abdul Kader Tayyab. And the question is this: thank you for your talk. And was there an Islamic political discourse about groups? The question just disappeared out of my chat. There we go. Okay, it's back. Was there an Islamic political discourse about groups going on at the same time among Nigerian Muslims?
So there were a couple of discourses that were ongoing. There was one that rose to the official level, the official sort of state authorized discourse, which then became this self-determination demand. And I know that by sort of focusing on what the state authorized and how those struggles played out on the side of a commission that had been set up by the state itself, it's almost as though I'm shifting the focus from societal discourse and not paying attention to that, and then focusing on what the state was doing. But I think that really by doing that, I think by focusing on how on the discourse that was authorized by the state and who engaged in that discourse and who got what, how were rights and disabilities distributed in that. Because I think by doing that, I think I shed light on how the state governed religious difference, which is what I really seek to do in the manuscript, but also on how, on what the consequences of those processes were for subjects in the state. But for sure, there were other forms of discourses, and this touches on a point that I was actually just about to mention before the question came in. So thinking back to the point that Professor Mamdani had made earlier this morning about, trying to imagine, an alternative future, and the fact that, much of the projects that were imagined as emancipatory and intended to resist colonial governance were actually already co-opted or were already predetermined, to put it more mildly, by the very forms of, by the very governance project that is sought to resist. And we see that happening in this story. But one group that really seemed to hold out in this story that I tell is a group of a Muslim minority group. And I, since I did this chapter, like I've always really hesitated in using the word minority because I feel like it doesn't tell us much, but I'm just going to describe them as a minority group in the sense that, this was a group that was not allied with the state and that actually was marginalized in different forms. So that group was the only sort of, player within this discourse within the constitutional political scene that actually imagined a polity in which there would be equal citizenship on the basis of individual rights as opposed to on the basis of group affiliation. So that was sort of the only group, and this was the group that was championed by Aminu Kano, Malam Aminu Kano, and which then, so it was sort of a group of himself and a group of other intellectuals who then formed the National Elements Progressive Union, the NEPO. And that group advanced really, an idea, an alternative vision that really sort of break out of the mold of, the Muslim, the Muslim, non-Muslim binary. The group centered sort of that discourse of other groups that really centered on on these, on tribal, religious, and ethnic-centered, forms of affiliation, and ethnic in the sense of the ways in which it was reified by the colonial state. But that discourse, unfortunately, did not make it to the official level. As I described, even though clearly what was going on the official level was not going to bring about emancipation, but at least it created a space to have a discussion. And what in fact happened was that this group was not even given the chance to even present their view at all. And so that idea remains, but it didn't rise to the level of official discourse, even a counter discourse at the official level.
Right. Oh, thank you. Thank you for that full answer. There are 3 more questions in the chat. We're going to hold them. Hopefully there was time at the end so that we don't go over time and we can move to the next panelist. But there are 3 questions that we'll hold from Carl Johnson, Moses Achonu, and Ayodeji Ogunake. And then I see 1 more or 2 from Ayodeji. So we'll hold those and hopefully we'll have time to engage them at the end of our overall Q&A. All right, thank you again, Professor Akande. We now turn to Professor Kassim. Take it away.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here for the virtual conference. I wish the conference was in person, so I would have gained the opportunity of meeting some of the amazing professors who I strongly admire. I would have met them in person. So today, for this paper of mine, The Caliphate as Nostalgia, Al-Imama, Khilafah, and the Muslim Political Theory of Rebellion, is part of my ongoing research on old and new continuity and change between old and new jihad in Muslim West Africa, old jihad being the 18th, 19th century jihad movement, and new jihad being the contemporary jihad movement. So for this particular paper, I intend to answer some questions. How have Muslims in African societies understood the concept of the Islamic Caliphate in the context of its loss of territorial control and sovereignty since the dawn of European colonialism? What are the historical roots of the discontent towards democracy and secular polities, both as a theory of government and an idea of society? Why are colonial and post-colonial Islamic rebellions hinged upon the emotive rhetoric of a lost caliphate and a call to reestablish the defunct African Islamic Empire state? Why does the multiplicity of Islamic movements with their idiosyncratic methods and goals seek to recreate Islamic polities as alternatives to the current European style political model? So to start with, remembering and longing for the lost caliphate. On 14th March 2008, Mohammed Yusuf, the former leader of the jihad movement, known by the pejorative Hausa Arabic name Boko Haram, he delivered a Juma khutbah. He titled the khutbah Sharing Mulki Malaka, the evils of colonialism. This particular khutbah was delivered on the 14th of March 2008 in commemoration of the 105th anniversary of the fall of the Sokoto Caliphate. During the sermon, Yusuf rekindled Muslim grief through evocative memory mobilization and collective remembering of the event of 1903, when the British conquered Hausa land and Borno, the areas that comprise today's northern Nigeria. It lamented how the British disbanded the caliphate and stripped the Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful, of his powers and sovereignty by replacing his official title with a politically less significant and ceremonial honorific Sultan of Sokoto. The catastrophic event of 1903, Yusuf bemoaned, was the most consequential tragedy that befell the Muslim Ummah in Belad Sudan. According to Yusuf, something had to be done to rectify the rupture that desecrated the organic institution of Islam and deprived the Muslim community of a sovereign political and religious leader responsible for the implementation and arbitration of the Sharia. Now, despite the competing institutionalized narratives about the jihad of Danfodio in Yusuf's region of provenance, in Borno, Yusuf was not alone in the emotional articulation of grief and longing for the revival of the glories of the defunct caliphate. Through powerful expressions of mourning and nostalgic reckoning with northern Nigeria's colonial history, leaders of contemporary movements of Islamic reform that preceded Muhammad Yusuf have also interpreted and unearthed memories of the violent destruction of the Islamic caliphate generated in the distant past. For example, In his autobiography, Where I Stand, dictated to and translated from Hausa into English by Ismaila Siga, Sheikh Abubakar Mahmoud Gumi, he died in 1992, the former Grand Qadi of Northern Nigeria and the spiritual patron of the anti-Sufi organization, Jama'at Izalatul Bid'ah wa Iqamatus Sunnah. He narrated how he privately counseled Sultan Siddiq Abubakar III, the 17th Sultan of Sokoto, for placing the British king, the spiritual head of the Anglican Church, in the same hierarchy with Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi and the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, in a speech on Eid al-Fitr. Abubakar Gumi said, and I quote, "Was it possible, therefore, that he could really thank the British king who came to our land to kill off the very values Danfodio struggled to uphold? Besides, could we, under the circumstances, actually be said to be living in peace and justice? After all, as God must stated in the Holy Quran, that He would never allow unbelievers to triumph over believers, if at all the believers were steadfast and sincere in their belief." Now, Abubakar Gumi was not alone. Sheikh Ibrahim Yaqub Zakzaki, he was born in 1953, the leader of the Shia Islamic movement of Nigeria. He also captured the haunting memories of colonialism and the symbolic loss of the event of 1903. In his 2004 Hausa sermon on colonialism titled Mulkin Malaka Torawa, Zakzaki narrated how members of IMN Academic Forum, how they organized a seminar at Bajoga, 4 kilometers from Borno, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the final battle between the forces of Muhammad Atahiro and the European colonizers. Zakzaki said, and I quote, Zakzaki said that Lugard forces killed Muhammad Atahiro in Borno. They urinated on the Quran and replaced Muhammad Atahiro with Muhammad Atahiro the first with Muhammad Atahiro the second. The latter became the British government and the flag utterly different from the went further to say, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary since the forces of Muhammad Atahiro fought the final battle against the British in Borno. By the mercy of Allah, one day we will come to this town to celebrate the flag of La ilaha illallah and burn the flag of the British. Similarly, in his diagnostic assessment of Muslim decline in Nigeria, Malam Ibrahim Suleiman, a Muslim activist and public intellectual, he also lashed upon the emotive rhetoric of the tragedy of colonialism. He said, the colonial era exposed the real diseases affecting Muslim society. There was a clear absence of articulate, sensitive, sincere, and courageous scholars to lead the Muslims against British imperialism. Now, all the people in contemporary Northern Nigeria collectively remember and grapple with the memory, culture, and emotion of the loss of the Islamic Caliphate to British colonialism as being a crucial factor in the society's understanding of the past, perceptions of the present reality, and ideas about the desired future. Now, the traditional ruling elites, ulama, intellectuals, activists, poets, and community historians have largely been successful in institutionalizing and transmitting the collective memory and valorization of the legacies of the Sokoto Caliphate in Northern Nigeria from one generation to another. Of particular interest is the way and manner the 40-hour legacy was memorialized in service of political legitimation and the campaign for one North, one God by Saudana and the Postcolonial Northern elites. 40 hours literature, the literature of Uthman Fodio, Abdullah Fodio, and Mohamed Bello, they were reprinted and they were collated under the Northern History Research Scheme. But Saudana and the Northern elites, they selectively mined the interpretation that fitted the political exigency of a unified one North, one God phenomenon. Several religious and political discourses in the 40-hour literature, including discourses on dissent, discourses on rebellion, discourses on who is a Muslim and who is not a Muslim, discourses on Islamic traditions of governance, discourses on territoriality, discuss on al-wala al-bara, and even discuss on slavery were politically ignored or were considered obsolete because these discourses did not fit into the usable history that can help to foster the one not one God phenomenon. Now, there've been series of discussion about Islamic political theory in Central Bilad Sudan. I mean, we have the works of Al-Maghili, Taj ad-Din, Fima Yajibu al-Mulk wa Salatin. We have Tahir Banari as well, who wrote Origins of Israt al-Muluk. Now, the Danfodio, the Fodia literature, they have their own well-defined Islamic political theory. I'm going to cite one particular example on how they discuss rebellion. In one of the manuscripts of Danfodio, the manuscript is titled Al-Ajiba al-Muharrar and Asir al-Muqarrar fi Wafiqat al-Shismas. This particular manuscript, it was written as a result of, Danfodio received a letter from Shismas Ahmed, and he responded to the questions of Shismas Ahmed. Shismas Ahmed is a historic scholar. We don't have much information about him. But the 10th question in that particular manuscript was the question of, is it permissible to rebel against Muslim ruler? And Danfodio explicitly stated that it is not permissible except when the ruler themselves show kufr bahwaha, like they show unbelief. Now, it was possible to be silent on specific aspects of the religious and political discourses of the 40-hour because there were no active movements of Islamic reform that underpinned their reformist ideas with a campaign to restore the lost Caliphate institution to its pristine form as they imagined it to have been before colonialism. Now, the individuals who were considered radical during the Sardauna period, including the figures like Aminu Kano, Saadu Zungo, Ibrahim Imam, and the revolutionaries of Nepu and Biwahem, these people did not present themselves or their revolutionary political ideology as continuity of the revivalist legacies and anti-colonial movement of Islamic reform and jihad that rebelled and established theocratic states across West Africa. The radicals were driven by a liberation and emancipatory ideology. They called for reform of the native authorities and they rallied support for the Talakawas. The poets, intellectuals, community historians like Akilu Aliyu, Muhazu Adeja, Mudisip King, Isa Ashim, Aliyu Namangi, the Ikma Club, and others, they fostered the rhetoric of societal reformation, they condemned moral vices, they condemned social vices, immorality. But this individuals, they did not engage with that reformist caliphate legacy of the 40-hour. Now, the religious and political discourses of the 40-hour, they were politically ignored during the late colonial and early independence period, will later be invoked as a template to support the emergence of new contemporary movement of Islamic reform. So if you look at today, what is happening? I mean, today, the leaders of Izala would not echo that sentiment of that grief of colonialism anymore because they've accommodated the state. They've accommodated the state and they're okay. They've accepted democracy. They're okay. All what they strive for is the Islamization of the society. IMN, that's Ibrahim Zakzaki, he has also accommodated the state to an extent as well because he faced punitive measure from the state. But now we have new jihad movements who are now going back to unearth this silenced religious and political discourses of Danfodio and they are unearthing these discourses and they're using these discourses for legitimation of their actions today. So we have, for example, Boko Haram in conclusion, Boko Haram and Sarah and so many other jihadi movements, going back to some of the texts of Danfodio, looking at the discourses on slavery, looking at the discussion of Ahkamudia, looking at the discusses for Humama, and so many other discusses that Sardauna and other northern elites know about, but they've been silenced on, they were silenced on these discourses because those discourses did not fit into the usable history they wanted for northern Nigeria during the early independence period. So in conclusion, I'm actually looking at the role of memory, historical memory, what the caliphate actually means to Muslims today. And is it possible to revere and celebrate the legacy of the old jihad movements and at the same time critique the new jihad movements who use some of the text and some of the doctrinal practices and interpretation of the old jihad movement to legitimate their contemporary action? This particular question is actually almost unresolved, I would say, to the best of my knowledge. And this is what I'm tracking in my research. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kassim. You ended with a very provocative question. Is this possible? And this is an unanswered question, as you say, that's still being debated. from your perspective, where are you on this question? How have your own views evolved as you've done this research?
I have to say that this particular topic is a very painful topic to discuss because on one hand, I also came from that tradition where I was socialized to revere the 40-hour tradition. I mean, I grew up in a society where we saw 40-hour as the emblem and the model for reform. But the more I go into the text of the 40-hour, what they actually wrote on key topics of slavery, on key topics on territoriality, and so many other topics, I don't seem to understand how, for example, contemporary Islamic scholars will accept Danfodio's rebellion against the Habib rulers, and the same arguments that Boko Haram and others are using today. And by the way, Boko Haram are not just using Danfodio's text alone. They are doing what I call hybridization, and I'm sure so the Boko Haram will definitely what you what they do is they hybridize multiple textual tradition, from the Salafi canon to the Jihad Salafi canon to the Ikhwan Muslim canon to different canons, but they also tap into the local history as well, because they know that Muslims, particularly in northern Nigeria, I mean, we revere this legacy, we celebrate it, but I think the Islamic scholars and even the Muslim intellectuals are really not prepared to have that conversation about some of those funny topics in the 40-hour literature that are now being used today to legitimize some of these political actions that we see from neo-jihad movements. I'm caught in between in this topic, but hopefully maybe at the end of my dissertation or at the end of my research or my book project, I will eventually come to a conclusion on that.
Thank you, thank you. Are there any questions, comments? Please place them in the Q&A. I see a couple coming in. Let's see. Okay, so Moses Achunu asked the question for you, Professor Kasim. How can one past event produce competing memories and visions? And how does the secular state feature in this story? So how can one past event no, it just disappeared. So let's see. Did you hear it? Did you get it the first time?
Can you repeat it?
Okay, sure. Here it is here. How can one past event produce competing memories and visions? And how does the secular state feature in this story? And that's Moses Achunu.
Okay, so the secular state fits into the story. The secular state fits into the story because there's that symbolic sense of loss, that what we have today is not the pristine Islamic political model that used to be. There's that sense of grief that something was taken away from us, and an alien civilization was imposed on us. And there's that sense of we need to return back to bring back that political model the way it used to be in Darul Islam. I have to say, it's not all the Islamic movement that have this particular vision. Some other movements have reconciled their political theology with the contemporary modern state, and they're fine. I mean, there's a lot of retraction. So many Islamic scholars have gone through a lot of retraction. In fact, during the course of my research, I mean, using Radiance magazine, the MSSN magazine, the Muslim magazine of the Muslim Student Society, I'm so surprised about what so many people preached in the past and what they're saying today. I mean, a very famous example is someone like Issa Ali Pantami, who is the minister. I mean, we could see that change as well in what he preached in the past and what the kind of model he embraced in the present. So many people have gone through retraction, but then there's some other groups that insist that no, we are not going to retract or accommodate the current status quo. It's an infidel, an alien system that needs to be rebelled against the same way that Fodiawa and the early Muslim reformers in West Africa rebelled against this. And to achieve that rebellion, they go ahead and doing takfir, they go ahead and invoking some of those past discourses that are actually in the text, and you read them in the text, but they are now being interpreted and translated into contemporary political and historical moments.
Thank you. There's another question from Adeji Oganake. Could you comment, please, on any significance of the fact that this emotion invocation of the nostalgic caliphate comes primarily from figures like Yusuf or Gumi, whose intellectual training lies primarily outside of the traditions of the Fodiawa?
Okay, I would say that the claim that the intellectual training of Gumi and Yusuf actually lie outside the tradition of the Fodiawa, I would put a caution to that. I would say it's not completely true and it's not false either. Unlike the early Muslim scholars whose curriculum were basically shaped by the Sahelian, the Maghrebian, what Charles Stewart and Bruce Orr call the core Islamic curriculum of West Africa, the subsequent Muslim reformers, they engage in what I call hybridity. So hybridity in the sense that they know the Fodiawa tradition. I mean, if you look at Gumi, for example, in fact, in where I stand, Gumi cited Danfodio as one of his Islamic heroes, as one of the heroes he actually look up to in Islamic history. So they know the Islamic tradition, but then in addition to the Fodiawa tradition, they also appropriate other intellectual training as well. Some of those training came from Sudan. Some of those intellectual influences came from Egypt. Some of those influences came from Saudi Arabia. In the case of the new jihad movements, the influences came from Islamic State. But what they're doing basically is hybridity, synthesizing different intellectual tradition for a predetermined goal or a vision, that anything that will help them to articulate that political vision is exactly what they will embrace. I mean, and that's why, for example, the Gumi, for example, or even Yusuf, they will not cite Danfodio's Sufism, because Danfodio's Sufism or his affiliation to Qadriya actually negates what they want to achieve. So you will see Gumi, for example, coming out to say that, oh, Danfodio left Sufism, despite almost more than 15 texts on Sufism, on Salasil Qadriya, Salasil Zahabiyya, and so many other texts that Danfodio wrote. I mean, Gumi came out to say that Danfodio left Sufism, and that was very hard to even comprehend. Muhammad Yusuf and even Shekau, they also do the same thing. I mean, you see in one of the particular texts that Shekau wrote, one of his few surviving texts, I mean, in that text, he cited Nur al-Bab, Siraj al-Ikhwan, Najma al-Ikhwan, and then he went ahead to present himself as her of Danfodio reformer. And for me, I'm like, how can you present yourself as an her when you're not a Sufi? You don't have any silsila. So they are also engaging in that selectivity that the Sardauna and the northern elite engaged in the early independence and in the late colonial and early independence. So the Sardauna generation, they avoided some questions and some of the texts of Danfodio because it doesn't fit into the narrative. The same way Gumi and other contemporary Muslim reformers also engage in that selectivity as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So there are a few other questions, and please, hopefully we'll have time at the end to circle back and answer all of the questions. Thank you so much, Professor Kasim. Before we turn to Professor Obadare, I realized that I forgot to actually introduce him. My apologies to you. So I want to do so now before turning it over to Professor Obadare. Ebenezer Obadare is Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR. Before joining CFR, he was Professor of Sociology at the University of Kansas. He's also been a Senior Fellow at NYU School of Professional Studies Center for Global Affairs, as well as a Fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute of Theology. Obadare has been a scholar at Ford Foundation International Scholar at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he completed his PhD in social policy in 2005. He is also the author and editor of numerous books, including Christianity, Sexuality, and Citizenship in Africa, 2019, Pentecostal Republic, Religion and the Struggle for State Power in Nigeria, 2018, Humor, Silence, and Civil Society in Nigeria, 2016, Governance and the Crisis of Rule in Contemporary Africa, Leadership and Transformation, 2016, The Handbook of Civil Society in Asia and Africa, 2014, and then also in 2014, Civic Agency in Africa, Arts and Resistance in the 21st Century. If that is an impressive resume, and there's more. The forthcoming book from the University of Notre Dame Press is titled Pastoral Power, Clerical State, Pentecostalism, Gender and Sexuality in Nigeria. And Professor Obadare is also the editor of the Journal of Modern African Studies and a contributing editor of Current History. Professor Obadare, take it away, please.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you for your kind introduction. I really appreciate it. So the title of my paper is Man of Letters to Man of God, the Social Origins of Clerical Authority in Nigeria. Let me quickly say that the paper itself draws on material from my forthcoming book, which you just generously mentioned. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the argument I advance, in the paper draws on a larger argument that I'm trying to frame in my work on the interaction between religion and politics over the course of the Nigerian Fourth Republic. So I'm going to try and produce a condensed version of that argument, keeping in mind that whoever really wants to have a more fleshed out version, it's important to read not just the forthcoming book, but the previous one, Pentecostal Republic, which came out in 2018. So I just wanted to get that out, before I say anything. So my paper has two broad aims. The first one is to provide a sketch of a historical sociology of the emergence and cultural ascendance of the figure of the contemporary Nigerian Pentecostal pastor. So why the pastor? Why now? It's a question everybody asks. My aim, not just in this presentation, but in the book from which I'm extracting it, is to answer these two questions. And then my second objective is to show why this emergence of the pastor is worth taking seriously as a lens into the changing nature of rule and political legitimacy against the vivid backdrop of mounting uncertainty, profound moral perplexity, social transformation, and political transition in Africa. The Nigerian milieu, I insist, offers a unique vantage point to undertake this type of investigation. My core argument is that the substitution of the man of letters by the man of God is one of the capital events in the Nigerian social structure over the Nigerian Fourth Republic. And that this substitution owes to disruptions, realignments, and discombobulations that trace back to the preceding era of military rule in the country. So since I'm juxtaposing the man of letters with the man of God, let me quickly explain what I mean by both. First, man of letters. So this is a descriptor I'm using more out of nostalgic affection than sociological precision. Since evidently the social class, or even the era, the early and mid-Victorian era that the men of letters appropriated, since that era is not extinct, what I really have in mind is the intellectual elite, primarily, though not exclusively, based in the universities. So when I say man of letters, there is no gender specific, it's not just about men, it's about people of letters, even though that sounds ponderous, but I just want people to know that I'm not just talking about men as men. So when I say man of letters, therefore, I have in mind more or less what Samuel Taylor Coleridge captured as the clerisy of a nation. That is its learned men and women, whether poets or philosophers or scholars. My basic intuition about intellectuals is that precisely because of their commitment to ideas beyond their instrumental value, every society needs them. Accordingly, a society without a functioning group of intellectuals is deprived of a certain level of consciousness and insight into vital problems. Because for various reasons, that need for insight into vital problems is arguably more acute across post-colonial societies. The poverty is accordingly more achingly felt. So I'm going to circle back to that in a moment. What about man of God? By man of God, I'm referring to your average Pentecostal pastor, the ubiquity of whom we can all agree is a self-evident truth, one to which anyone who keeps a tab on African affairs or has traveled across the continent can testify. The simple fact is that there's really no escaping the Pentecostal pastor anywhere you turn, whether politics, education, public policy, sport, or popular culture. So far from an authority whose remit is limited to strictly spiritual matters, today's Pentecostal pastor is what elsewhere I've described as a widely sought after existential micromanager. So why pastoring? One draw is the opportunity that pastoring affords for social becoming, meaning that for the average young person, for the average young Nigerian, otherwise unable to access employment and therefore unable to discharge normative social, cultural, and filial obligations, due to the prolonged crunch in the formal labor market. Pastoring, requiring, it must be noted, little by way of seed investment, is an attractive option. For young people facing the danger of permanent consignment to the social margins, pastoring is often the very last opportunity to become someone. Another draw is that pastoring is the quickest route to the social privileges and social legitimacy ordinarily accruing to other professions, lawyer, doctor, professor, etc., but without any of their ethical strictures or training requirements. Compared with the material dividend from, say, training to be a lawyer, which can be uncertain, pastoring promises instant material rewards, a degree of social respect that the ordinary professional can only dream of, and connections to the political and business elites at national and transnational levels. In a credential-conscious society like Nigeria, being a pastor may well be the ultimate credential. And within the Nigerian, what I call the Nigerian economy of prestige, few identities are more prestigious than that of the pastor. But how, at any rate, did pastors get to accumulate such enormous cultural capital? What cracks in the social edifice have they exploited? My argument is that the pastor, also known as man of God, is the ultimate beneficiary of the decline of the Nigerian intelligentsia, the man of letters. The decline itself, part of the overall degradation of the Nigerian university system. It is not so much that the man of God now enjoys the status and privileges once reserved for the man of letters, as that the man of God has stepped into the vacuum created by the delegitimizing of the former. Now, the decline of the Nigerian intelligentsia, suffice to say, is a long and complicated process, and time will not permit me to go into a comprehensive sociological excavation. I'm shameless enough to encourage those interested in a full-blown analysis to pre-order a copy of my book. But the long and short is that by the early 1980s, Nigerian universities had fallen on hard times, prompting the attrition of leading academics to European, and North American universities. The reputation of Nigerian intellectuals as respected occupants of rarefied ivory towers took a corresponding nosedive. By the late 1980s, the university system had grown into a mammoth patrimonial edifice characterized by rigid hierarchical structures, arbitrariness in decision-making, and patron-client relations. The increasing severity of the economic crisis and political dysfunction in the country was such that university teachers suddenly faced the existential risk of not being able to maintain a respectable position within the changing structure of the national elite, even as the crisis greatly eroded the capacity of academics to defend their social status and forced a sharp differentiation among their ranks between those who were able to penetrate government bureaucracies and those who have had to confront radically reduced opportunities at the workplace. Just as the intellectual elite was giving up as a core conscious of its group identity, position in the social hierarchy, social function, and not last but not least, status in the Nigerian society, the state was undergoing its own crisis of identity, progressively uncertain of its mission as the institution primarily vested with the organization of social welfare. Its ensuing retrenchment, I'm talking about the state's retrenchment, had two main consequences. First, it created a discursive gap into which a multitude of contending narratives, the most decisive of which is the Pentecostal worldview, have stepped. While there was no inevitability as to this outcome, Pentecostalism's narratological triumph seems to have been aided by, among other things, the fact that it possesses a coherent theory of history and futurity, including an explanation of the crisis of the Nigerian state and society, not to mention a confidence in its own divinely ordained mission to lead the country out of its morass. Second, state retrenchment unleashed a fury of entrepreneurial schemes and ventures, many of dubious legality in the popular economy, one of which is pastoring, a profession that, as I just indicated, involves minimal risk-taking and even less investment by way of startup. Now, I'm using popular economy here to describe the range of livelihood, employment, and capital asset creation that emerged as oil and the state retreated into their own fortress, literally off limits to everyday citizens. Accordingly, the popular economy neither completes a national economy by complementing the formal sector, nor constitute a whole system in and of itself. Rather, my claim is that it is a series of localized meeting places for economic organizations that have in common their relatively low level of formal regulation. As a model of private enterprise with low barriers to entry that thrives under conditions of minimal regulation, Pentecostal pastoring checks all the boxes. Finally, pastoring has profited from the moral and spiritual restlessness that is concomitant to the economic angst that I've just outlined. As the hunger for meaning, power, and salvation has intensified, so as the spiritual economy itself become further deregulated. In this expanded spiritual economy, Pentecostal pastors, standard bearers of a ubiquitous Pentecostalism, have emerged as prime actors. Even then, and as a quick glance at the spiritual landscape will reveal, it is important to stress that pastors by no means command an uncontested view. On the contrary, and for all their undoubted visibility and influence, they are in the end just one of the many avenues of spiritual comfort for people, sharing and often contesting authority and oftentimes physical space with sundry magical spiritual entrepreneurs, including astrologers, palm readers, oracles, and various spiritual assistants and consultants. Now, allow me to close with just two quick observations. The first one is that the professor to pastor change of baton that I'm postulating ought to be apprehended within the broader stream of the rise and fall of contending social and occupational forces against the backdrop of incessant elite rearrangements and status disruptions in the country. As such, not only is it not set in stone, if anything, we may reasonably expect that contingent upon favorable changes in both the social organization of knowledge, production, and the broader Nigerian milieu, the man of letters could well reclaim its old position in the cultural hierarchy. Second, in reflecting on the emergence and visibility of the pastor, my intention is to buttress the socio-anthropological and legal literature on power and authority in Africa, particularly in that literature's emphasis on the elusive question of rule and legitimacy. I'm interested, for one thing, in the legal understanding of power, particularly where what exists in reality coincides with the mandates and requirements of law. For another, I'm intrigued by departures from such coincidences, insofar as they enable a deeper understanding of how power is composed and operates as a matter of fact, and what the tension between what the law specifies and what brute facticity demands means for the everyday performance of authority in Nigeria. Finally, and this is my final comment. Finally, given the common assumption among the public that secular authority is permanently shadowed by, and in fact is impotent without some form of spiritual enabling, an assumption that many holders of secular office give teeth to with their actions, I'm interested in what those transactions, whether overt or covert, between secular and religious agents say about the exercise of power within a notionally democratic matrix. For Nigeria and other African countries now finally beginning to see military rule in their rear view mirror, that this is an important consideration, goes without saying, especially as for many of them, the key political question about liberal democracy is that of the locus of rule. Thus, my postulation of Pentecostal pastors as a new axis of authority is a specific nod at the problems and contradictions of power and authority in a context where democratic rule, emergent from the ruins of yesterday's martial despotism, is yet to fully assert itself. In other words, the collapse of military rule, the nascent nature of liberal democratic rule, the escape into religion to relieve the existential consequences of economic collapse and moral failures on all fronts, not least in the spheres of governance and social relations. All this created a vacuum which the Pentecostal pastor has artfully and seemingly irreversibly stepped into. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Obadare. So there are questions coming into the chat, and I want to share in advance so that we have enough time at the end for questions to come in, for the panelists to interact with each other. We'll just forego the break. Perhaps you can, individually, folks can do that on their own, but we'll just move through the program. We have a good momentum, so we would like to keep that. So there's a question in the chat, Professor Obadare, from an anonymous attendee, doesn't identify themselves, but the question is this: how do you think this role, and I imagine man of God, man of letters, these roles maybe, differ in Nigeria versus in Nigerian diasporic communities? So a broad question. How do these roles differ, in your view, in Nigeria versus in Nigerian diasporic communities?
That's a very interesting question. And I've never really thought of that. I think it will depend on that community, its social composition, its location, and the extent to which, those, the members, of that community are exposed or disposed to the message, of the man of God. But I imagine that wherever you are, I mean, not just as a Nigerian, but I think the claims I'm making apply, to the rest of the continent as well. I think it's undeniable that we've seen a very, broad transition from what you might call, rule, based on reason, authority based on reason, to what I'm calling authority based on prodigy. So that, for me, is the essence of the transition from the man of letters, from the, to the man of God. The point I'm making is that wherever you are, no matter what you're doing, if you're looking at African politics, right now, if you're looking at Nigerian politics, part of what grabs you is the visibility, the social significance, and the cultural mattering, of the man of God. What I'm trying to then account for is, where is that coming from, right? So whether you are in Africa or you are in the African diaspora, I think basically you see the same, the same phenomenon, at work. But depending on the composition of that community, it's the influence of the man of God, might as well vary.
Sure, no, thank you. So there are two questions that I think I can merge together, but I'll read them separately.
Okay.
You can see distinctions in them. So one is from Oludumini Oganake. Thanks for taking on this important and thorny topic so carefully. Can you comment on the significance of the fact that so many of the popular Pentecostal pastors, Obadare, Kumuyi, etc., got their training in mathematics and the sciences and hold PhDs? So amongst these Pentecostal pastors, they seem to come from a class of men of scientific letters. What does this tell us about the relationship between these forms of authority, educational, spiritual, and political? So I'll let you meditate on that question, soak that in, because I think Moses's question kind of builds on this.
Yeah.
To what extent does the prestige and cultural capital of the professor and the pastor depend on a pre-existing Nigerian/African culture of deference and fealty to men and women of learning and authority?
Yeah.
Learning and authority in both a spiritual and a secular sense.
Thank you. You're right. Thank you, Professor Chonu. Thank you, Professor Ogunake. I think both questions actually are connected. Part of what I try to draw out in the forthcoming book is part of the point I make is that it's not just that we've had the transition, the transition I'm claiming from man of letters to man of God, but such is the ardor, of the man of God, that the thing you want to be as a man of letters is to be called a pastor, right? So it's no longer enough to say I'm professor. You also now want to be say so there are so many professor reverends and professor pastors, out there. But the earlier part of that question, Professor Ogunaike's question, I think is really interesting, which is, the fact that many of these pastors, are, university educated, many of them, studied, the physical sciences. I think one explanation is that these are also members of a particular generation, right? So Bakari is a lawyer, what's his name? Adeboye is a mathematician, that these are more or less members of the same generation. They grew up at a time in Nigeria, especially in Western Nigeria, where to be socially respectable, you had to be an educated person, right? So, but part of what has happened, specifically to that quote is that part of what they trade on, part of how they justify their own prestige is to say, look, I know what obtains in the academy. I used to be a professor. Part of what that does is to strengthen their message, right? So it's one thing to say, I'm a pastor, I'm a man of God. Listen to me, I have the calling. It's another one to say, I used to invoke the authority of reason. I was a professor. But what do I do now? I'm invoking the authority of faith. So the back and forth, between those two modes, of authority, I think the dynamic is actually very interesting. But my argument is that for good or for ill, one, the latter, the man of God, has totally taken over the man of letters. It is that mutual substitution and what it means for how we understand authority, how we understand, the locus of power, in the democratic context. Who do people look onto? Who do they ask questions? Who do you talk to if you need to think when you need explanations about the economy, about politics? You used to talk to, the professor of political science. Today, you talk to the man of God. That's the transition I'm interested in. And that's what I think what makes it all the more remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Prof. All these papers are so fascinating. We just have to keep the momentum, and we can go directly to Professor Salem to continue our conversation. And we hope to have time at the end. If we didn't get to your question immediately, hopefully there'll be time at the end to address them. So Professor Salem, take it away.
My paper is titled Islam and the Postcolonial States in Africa, the Formation of the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. I just wanted to comment on the title because I want to explain what formation means to me. I had in mind when I was crafting this title, the distinction that John Lansdale and Bruce Berman made in their book on Kenya called Unhappy Valley, where they distinguish between the process of construction of state and the process of formation. Construction being more related to public policies and a conscient effort to build a nation or a polity, and formation being the series of accidents of events that leads to emergence of political formation. So I just wanted to clear that out. The first ideas about the idea of the formation of Islamic Republic came to me when I was writing a book back in the 2012-2013, a book published in French called Précédé dans le désert, Islam, Politique et Changement Social. It's a book published in French about Islam and social change in Mauritania. And in the first chapter of that book, I was trying to reconstruct the formation of the post-colonial states in Mauritania. And one of the ideas that I didn't have the time really to elaborate up in that book was the idea that the Islamic Republic is less of a political project than it is a series of accidents and misunderstandings. Then in 2013, while Halak published his book about the impossible states, where he explains that it is impossible to build an Islamic state in modern times, not because there is no concept or project or precise theory of Islamic state in Islam, but because modernity is amoral and any Islamic state would have to follow Sharia, which is a moral project. Then I was recently, after publication of my book, after reading Wael Halak and trying to grapple with his argument, I was inspired by other readings such as mainly Noah Salamon's book, For the Love of Prophet, on the Islamic state building experiment in Sudan. So this paper is basically my way of trying to catch up with all these discussions that are ongoing. And one of the merits, I think, of this paper for those who read it, or those who might read it in the future, is the fact that it really offers a glimpse into the trajectory of the Islamic State experiment in Africa, and it is only the second project that looks at those experiments in conjunction with Noah Solomon's book. So that's why the paper starts off as a conversation between Noah Solomon's book on Sudan and my own previous book and the new paper. So I am not sure that is very clear, but the main argument of the paper is the fact that the post-colonial authorities in Mauritania didn't intend to build an Islamic religious project. They didn't intend to build a republic that is religiously framed. They didn't have any ideology of an Islamic state. Their ideas and their project and their objective were purely political. And I will explain some of their objectives. But I want to really make a connection between these remarks and the material I'm drawing on, and what Professor Mamdani said today in response to that question on the relationship between nomads and the state. And I think that is an excellent segue from the few remarks I'm going to do today. Professor Mamdani said that we need to do more work on the imagination of African nationalists, and this is exactly what I've done in this book, in this paper. I think his suggestion is a perfect segue to the paper, because when post-colonial authorities in Mauritania and the post-colonial nationalist elites decided to call Mauritania an Islamic Republic, they couldn't be further than from the idea of building a theological polity. So their idea was really to draw on the common denominator between a multi-ethnic society in Mauritania that is partly Arabs, Berber, African, etc. And some of the tensions that emerged to the runner-up to the independence in the last decade of colonialism in Mauritania were sending signals that there will be, after independence, a number of ethnic tensions, and everything was in place to lead to ethnic crisis, etc., and at least ethnic controversies. This is where the idea of creating an Islamic Republic came from, drawing on the idea that all Mauritanians are Muslims. So my point is to demonstrate that really the Islamic Republic label was used as a tool for legitimacy for the new independent states. I can't, unfortunately, go read the entire paper, but I submitted the paper. Those who read it know what I'm talking about. I'm just going to sketch it quickly. What the post-colonial elite in Mauritania wanted to do is really to face a double challenge. One is internal and one is external. The external challenge is obvious. Mauritania was highly contested by its neighbors. I mean, the French Sudan and the Sudanese Federation, Senegal and Mali, were very hesitant in accepting the sovereignty of Mauritania on its territory, and Morocco plainly said that Mauritania belongs to the kingdom. So Mauritanian authorities had to find a way to unify the society. The other threat to the viability of the post-colonial project in Mauritania was the existence of a lot of hesitancy among the public. And this is where the idea of imagination of nationalists is interesting to discuss. Traditional authorities had just became very comfortable dealing with colonial authorities. They have come to terms with colonial domination, even though they resisted for a long time. But in 1950s, in the runner-up to independence, they have been able to somehow establish a rapport with the colonial authorities, and they were able to have some kind of status that allowed them to have power over the population, and to so they were hesitant to accept the leadership of a new modernized French-speaking or French-trained elite, because that would strip them from the power they were starting to get hold of under colonization. So this is, I think, a good justification of the Islamic project. And when you read the memoirs of the first nationalist in Mauritania, particularly the first president, you find a clear push against Islamization of the state, or any attempt at using that Islamic Republic label in order to transform the nationalist project in Mauritania into a theological project or religious project in which theologians and Islamic scholars will have some form of authority. So I give a lot of examples of that and quotations. So the Islamization of the Islamic Republic in Mauritania would happen, as paradoxical as that might sound, would happen only much later in the 80s, and a number of other factors that are not religious factors. Those factors are social transformation of Mauritania from a predominantly nomadic society to urban society. I mean, the numbers there are startling. In the wake of the drought of the late 60s and early 70s, roughly Mauritania went from being 80% of nomads to being 15% of nomads in a matter of a decade. So that created a Muslim public that is now live in cities and is able to interact to create a kind of nascent public sphere in which Islamist ideas were not really present. But modernist ideas, leftism, etc., were prevalent. It was only beginning from the 80s that, under the push from a worldwide movement for Islamization of Muslim societies, and also in the context of a push of the regime back then, the President Haidar regime, who was a pious individual, and he was under pressure to proclaim Sharia as the law of the land, that he took a number of decisions that would really bring back the project of Islamic Republic in Mauritania. In the paper, I give the number of decisions that were made in order to bring back the project of Islamic Republic. And I also show that that project was not really always successful, and it was not systematic. Interestingly, the return of the Islamic State project would open up spaces for people to contest what Islam means. And I have in mind here, and I described this in the paper, the debate over the abolition of slavery in 1980. Mauritania was the last country to abolish formally slavery, to pass a law abolishing slavery in 1980 under pressure from social movement for the liberation of former slaves and slaves in Mauritania and from emancipation of Haratins. This is a community from slave background. And on that occasion, President Haidar, who had just proclaimed Sharia as a law of the land, felt he had no choice but to consult ulama and scholars. And the ulama and scholars open up a national debate about the meaning of slavery in Sharia, which is unprecedented. An open debate about Islamic law in the country brought back the primacy of Sharia and Islam in Mauritania. But it also brought back the idea that anybody can partake in that debate, not only Islamic scholars. And there has been debate over the radio over the idea of abolition and whether it's legal, etc. And this is a perfect example of a trend that will be sustained afterwards, in which regular actors would use the pretext of the existence of an Islamic Republic to contest the very official version of Sharia. And I give the example of anti-slavery activists in recent times who did a number of provocative demonstrations in order to contest the orthodoxy and the version of Sharia that is enforced by Mauritanian authorities and the justice system with regard to slavery, unpaid work, etc. And one of the most spectacular manifestation of that that protest is a book burning that happened in 2012 at the hands of anti-slavery activists who are very well known in Mauritania, such as Biram al-Abeid, who burned a number of Sharia books. And that sparkled a nationwide debate about who speaks for Islam in the Islamic Republic, and led to a number of reforms, which indicate that the shape of the Islamic Republic is still in negotiation. And contrary to the literature, we don't know what an Islamic Republic should look like. And actors in Muslim societies keep interpreting it and performing the Islamic Republic as they go about their process of state construction and state formation. Last point I wanted to raise here is the idea that Islamic State or Islamic Republic or self-proclaimed or self-styled Islamic polities are anti-secular. If you look closely to the kind of policies followed in Mauritania and the ways in which regular actors or activists or political players try to participate, you might see that these experiments are both secular and not secular. You can't decide whether they are secular, and it's not really their focus to display a form of adherence to secularism or not. That's just not relevant to them. So at times, these political formation display characteristic of secularism, and at times they don't. The most important aspect here I want to keep in mind is that the Islamic experiment in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, as it is in Sudan, as Noah Solomon beautifully demonstrated, is a performance, is something that is ongoing, and it goes against the idea that Islamic states are impossible or Islamic experiments are impossible. I am very happy to bring this Mauritanian experiments to the readership, because when you read reference books on Islam or Islamic State, you have no mention of countries like Mauritania and very little on Sudan, only in passing, as though Africa is outside of the Muslim world or its political experiment are not relevant to the ongoing conversation about Islamic State, Islamic polities, etc. So I just wanted to go against the grain on that particular point. I'm sorry if I went beyond my 10 minutes, and that will be it for me.
So it's all right, Professor Salem. There's much to share. We'll move right into a question. There's a question from an anonymous attendee, well, I'm going to combine questions. So here's a question from Olodumini Oganake. Thank you so much for this very rich paper that advances so many discussions about Islam and the modern state. Could you speak a bit more about the role of both formal, in quotation marks, government-sponsored education and the non-government sponsored education and these projects of Islamization or making an Islamic state a society? Okay, so that question between formal government-sponsored education, non-government sponsored education, and questions. And then there's another question around population, around identity, Moors or what they, and I don't know what the question is referring to as the they part, called Negro Mauritanians. So that might have some salience for you. Those are the two questions that we'll have.
That rings a bell. Okay. So first question about formal and informal education. I mean, Islamic authority in Mauritania is very interesting in its structure in terms of the coexistence between a number of state institutions that dispense and offer Islamic education and informal. We have in Mauritania a tradition of private family or traditional Islamic schools and universities that have been always powerful in Mauritania and still are, and they definitely offer training to not only Mauritanians, but also international students, and they've been in existence for centuries. And these are typically owned by families that are tied to Sufi brotherhoods, such as the Tijaniya, but not always. Some of these very prestigious traditional universities called Mahdara are not tied to a particular Sufi school. Some of them are openly, somebody would say, Salafist in terms of creed, etc. So we have a very powerful network of those traditional schools, and they have real precedence in terms of credential, in terms of reach in the Mauritanian public sphere. Their sheikh and their leaders also keep still holding a lot of Islamic authority and power. In the meantime, as the Islamic Republic, beginning from the 1980s, finds itself under pressure to co-opt some of the traditional authorities, it created a number of institutions. The first one is the Higher Institute of Islamic Studies, and the objective of that institute was to formalize, to constitute a bridge between traditional education in the Mahdara and in order to modernize those curriculum, but also in order to recognize that education and to allow people to enter the corridors of the administration, to be hired as teachers. And that program actually was one of the most instrumental in bringing about what is called in Mauritania Arabization, putting Arab as the first language of education constitutionally. So they played a huge role and succeeded in basically getting rid of French as the lingua franca and the official language of the state, which is no more the case. So that attempt from the part of the state to associate graduate of the traditional system has been extremely instrumental. That process of creation of state-sponsored Islamic education universities has increased recently as part of an attempt from the previous regime before 2019 to regain some of its Islamic legitimacy. They created a very interesting experiment called the Model Mahdara, basically creating a state-sponsored traditional Islamic informal university, formalizing it and sponsoring it in order to wrestle back those schools from people they can't control politically. Of course, this has much to do with a program on global war and terror and African state being asked by their partners to monitor and have more control over Islamic education in particular and Islamic knowledge in general. So that's another story. The Islamic Republic also created a number of bodies that would give the state some credibility as an Islamic actor. So I can't give all those now because I think that will take a lot of time, but the involvement of the state in informal education and its effort trying to formalize Islamic education in order to control it is an ongoing process and accelerating actually in recent times.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Salem. So for there are a few more questions in the chat that we can't get to, but each panelist has the opportunity to type in their answers directly to the person posing a question. So Professor Salem, Noah Salomon has a question in the chat. I know your works are in conversation with each other. So if you don't have a chance to loop back after Professor Thurston's talk, you can respond in that directly. Okay.
I don't see the questions. Sorry.
Oh, we'll share them. We'll share them with you so that you'll be able to see them.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you so much, Professor Salem. We will now move to Professor Alexander Thurston.
Thanks so much for this invitation, and I'm really glad to be on this panel. I've been learning a great deal from my fellow panelists, and yeah, really excited to participate in the conference as a whole. My paper, I think, will have some productive overlap, I hope, with the first two papers, and particularly with the second paper. My paper focuses in particular on what I'm calling the politics of writing Sokoto's history in independence era Nigeria. So I'm particularly interested in a set of politicians and a set of historians during the 1950s and 60s in particular. And I'm interested in sort of four forms of tensions there. One is what I look at as a kind of uneasy overlap between what might be called sort of generic Nigerian nationalism at this time, and then a specifically kind of Northern Nigerian Islamic identity formation, and looking at how some of the same figures, so the Fodiawa whom Abdul Basit talked about earlier, so Uthman Danfodio, Mohammed Bello, Abdullahi Danfodio, how they could be used as either generic symbols of Nigeria's past, or how they could be deployed as specifically relevant to certain projects of what it meant to be a Northern Nigerian Muslim in the era of decolonization. The second kind of tension that I'm interested in is the tensions between, on the one hand, sort of glorifying the past and presenting the Sokoto Caliphate as a kind of near utopia, and then also so that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the idea, the sort of modernist impulses or Islamic modernist impulses of some of the independence era leaders, particularly Ahmadu Bello. So sometimes Ahmadu Bello would both depict Northern Nigeria, the 19th century past as this kind of core set of values to draw upon, but then would also sort of present it as quaint and talk about himself as this modernizing reformer who was bringing, electricity and medicine and modern technology and sort of bringing the country into the future. Then the third kind of tension that I'm interested in is what I see as a very unequal kind of interaction between some of the Europeans and Americans who were kind of taking the lead on writing English language histories during this period, and then their Northern Nigerian informants. So a lot of times the sort of highest levels of academic prestige, even within certain Nigerian universities at the time, would accrue to either again, European and American historians, or maybe Southwestern Nigerian historians. And then Northern Nigerians were sometimes more in the role of informants and suppliers of manuscripts and so forth. And then the fourth sort of area of tension that I'm interested in is how language mattered, and the kind of differences you could see even among the same figures, such as Ahmadu Bello, in terms of how they were presented in different languages. And as I mentioned, sometimes within English language production during the time, Northern Nigerians more played the role of informants and suppliers of manuscripts, but then at the same time, even some of those same intellectuals were producing their own works in Hausa or in Arabic. And so there was a kind of, in a way, three streams of production about 19th century history during the independence era, but those streams were not always in direct conversation with one another. So those are some of the themes in the paper. In terms of the body of the paper, so I'm very interested just in the mechanics of intellectual production during this time. So I look at a particular network of historians who include Mervyn Hiskett, HFC Smith, who later converted to Islam and became known as Abdullahi Smith, Murray Last, and various others who were deeply involved in producing histories during this time. I look then too at even the physical process of generating the materials and the archives that they relied upon. So the role that the University of Ibadan played as a key center from the late 1940s on, the collection of manuscripts and how, again, the sort of unequal roles that were played in that process by Northern Nigerian informants and then by the collectors of the manuscripts. I look too at the kinds of journals and academic societies that were key to the production of articles and then later books about the Sokoto Caliphate during the 1950s and 60s. And I look then at how the center of gravity for production of these histories gradually moved from Ibadan and up to the north with the creation of Ahmadu Bello University in 1962 and with the creation of other infrastructures in the north during the early 1960s. I'm also interested in kind of the intellectual orientation of the histories that were produced during this time. A lot of the leading historians, as I mentioned, were European and American. Relatively few of them were Muslim, but even the non-Muslims had a very, very sympathetic view of what the Sokoto Caliphate or the Sokoto experience had been. And I think their overall view was really informed by a kind of great man of history outlook that had a really sort of top-down view of what the Sokoto experience had been. In part, they were responding to, or in large part, they were responding to more explicitly colonialist histories that had really portrayed the Sokoto jihad in racial terms as a kind of Fulani venture, and there was a self-conscious effort to move away from that and to place emphasis back on Islamic thought. I think the advantage of that, right, was moving away from sort of, you know, racial caricatures and so forth. The disadvantage then maybe was again this top-down view of and a bit of a kind of again sometimes near utopian view of what the Sokoto experience had been. And then I look at the ways that intersected with politics and with the way that Ahmadu Bello, who was the premier of the northern region from 1954 to 1966, how he wanted to present himself in politics as he was the descendant of Othman Danfodio and Mohamed Bello, and he drew heavily on that you know, genealogical connection. And then, as I mentioned before, he also, you know, sort of tried to navigate a space of presenting himself as this Islamic modernist reformer, but then also as the reviver of the 19th century past. From the research so far, and I'm you know, still in a mid stage of this, but you know, to me, I don't necessarily see a lot of examples, especially during the 50s, of kind of direct coordination between Bello and some of the European historians. But I do see a kind of shared ethos and an overlap in their projects. And, you know, in fact, Professor Last was fairly explicit about this, and even in recent years. So I'll read just one quote from him. This is from the bottom of page 4 of my paper, quoting from an essay by Professor Last in Premium Times, a Nigerian newspaper, talking about the decision to refer to the 19th century experience as the Sokoto Caliphate rather than as the Fulani Empire. So he said, the decision to relabel the historical state whose capital was at Sokoto was partly intellectual, partly political. Intellectual because we needed a properly Islamic term for a properly Islamic state, and a term that could be justified both on textual evidence and on a technical legal rationale. Political because the newly autonomous regional government of northern Nigeria under the leadership of Sir Ahmadu Bello needed an ethnicity-free model on which to base its new political pluralist morality of work and worship. So again, I didn't necessarily find evidence of you know, tight, direct coordination, and I'm not in any way, by the way, portraying these historians as you know, politically subservient to Ahmadu Bello, but they were clearly paying attention to his political project and maybe had some serious kind of sympathy for it, as well as sympathy for the caliphate leaders themselves. And then last in the paper, I look a little bit at the legacies of that work from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and how it was drawn upon by later figures, you know, later intellectuals, particularly a set of northern intellectuals in the 1980s. So figures such as Ibrahim Suleiman. And, you know, interestingly, there's some quotations available from Hiskett and Last, you know, reviews of these later works. Or reflections on them, where Hiskett in particular recognized some of the issues that could come up when his own work was favorably cited and built upon by Nigerian Islamist intellectuals. So there's a quote from Hiskett that really stood out to me, where he was giving a preface to the second edition of his book, where the second edition came out in 1994. And he wrote in that, one may concede that it was inevitable that these 19th century reformers, in other words, Danfodio and Bello, et cetera, should regard the truth as absolute, not relative. but the unqualified restatement of such a view by a late 20th century Muslim goes far to explain the acute anxiety of Nigerian Christians in regard to Islam, and it at least partially explains the parallel absolutist response of some Christian evangelists. So, in other words, I think it's really interesting how at different moments, the same version of what the Sokoto experience had meant could have really different ramifications for understandings of Northern identity and then for national Nigerian identity. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there because I know there may be questions for other panelists, so I don't want to run too long. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Thurston. Are there any questions in the chat for Professor Thurston? Please put them in. Okay, I see one here from Anwar Omish. Professor Thurston, do you see Western disciplinary boundaries shaping the study of the Sokoto Caliphate? Do the types of narratives produced differ from scholars situated in Islamic studies, in quotation marks, Orientalism, versus anthropology, versus African studies, versus other fields? Or did these writers see themselves as within just one specific discipline? So there are three questions in one, so I'll repeat them very quickly. Do you see Western disciplinary boundaries shaping the study of the Sokoto Caliphate? Do the types of narratives produced differ from scholars situated in Islamic studies versus anthropology, versus African studies, versus other fields? Or did these writers see themselves as within just one specific discipline?
Thanks. Yeah, these are excellent questions. I think in the 50s and 60s, the dominant discipline, at least within Ibadan and then within ABU, was history, and a sense that that there were that this was a pivotal moment, and it really was. I mean, all the systematic collection of manuscripts and so forth, and that fit in with more generically kind of nationalist ideas that Nigerian history needed to be retold. That it needed to be told on the basis of sources other than just European colonial accounts. There was a big emphasis on collecting oral history when it came to other parts of Nigeria, but then with the North, I think there was a sense, and it was a real sense, right? It's and I share that sense. It's just a treasure trove of documents that were available. But again, I think that within history, or at least the history writing of the time, there was this real sense of top-down, great man of history kind of approaches. In terms of how that has played out in more recent writing on Sokoto and so forth, I haven't gotten there in the research yet, so I'll pass on that aspect.
Thank you. There's a question from a fellow panelist, Professor Kassim.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Diston, for your paper. I just have a quick question for you. This might be a reflective question. Do you think that the location of manuscripts actually shaped the kind of history that was produced? When I mean location of manuscripts, do you think that scholars like Mervyn Isket, Murray Last, particularly Murray Last, who worked with was originate, do you think he would have produced a book that is probably different or from the Sokoto Caliphate if the manuscripts available to him were located in a place like Northwestern University and not in Waziri Junaid History Bureau, for example? The location of manuscript, do you think that it shaped the kind of questions that historians were asking, because there's always the presence of gatekeepers and this insider, outsider dynamics. And the reason I'm saying that is in my current engagement with manuscripts, the kind of question I can ask looking at manuscripts, sitting in a place like Northwestern, the way I will read that the manuscript is quite different from the way I will read the manuscripts in a place like maybe Sokoto in Kano. And for me, even when I had to go back to some of the scholars in Northern Nigeria to study some of the manuscript, because the manuscript is beyond philology, just knowing the language. You also need to know the textual anthropology, which is not possible sometimes without sitting down with the ulama and actually learning from the ulama. But what I have discovered is some of the ulama are willing to answer questions, but for some, it's very difficult for me to ask certain questions. But that limitation is not available when when I consult like Indigenous Archive Program of the British Library, or I consult like Northwestern University, Falke, Onwe collection, Payton collection, do you think this limitation also shaped the kind of history that was produced during this early period? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the question almost answers itself, right? I mean, yeah, I definitely do. I mean, I think, you know, as you probably know, the book is, you know, the Sokoto Caliphate is dedicated to the Waziri, right? He talks extraordinarily fondly about his time in the Waziri's house. I mean, I think that, you know, I think that kind of access and being at the frontier of scholarship at that time, I mean, obviously it was an extraordinary opportunity. I think that's a big part of why the book has had such an enduring influence. But then you mentioned, you know, the role of gatekeepers, right? And I think it's a very favorable view of the caliphate. Even the use of the word caliphate has been contested. So yeah, I definitely think it matters where one sits. And one could also point out, I mean, I didn't mention this in the presentation, but it's in the paper a bit. I mean, you know, that Hiskett was a colonial administrator himself, right, and had been at the School for Arabic Studies and so forth, and had a key role in shaping, you know, the trajectories of figures like Abu Bakr Gumi, who came up in your presentation. So yeah, I think that where people sat career-wise, geographically, in terms of who they were in conversation with, yeah, I think that mattered a great deal.
Thank you. Moses Achunu has a question, offering thanks first for the presentation. The question is this: do you think that sources and the gatekeeping of sources have anything to do with the pro-caliphate political sympathy of the caliphate historiography you've beautifully surveyed?
Yeah, no, I definitely do. I mean, and I think there was just so much excitement about the sources, right? And that excitement comes across, and that excitement is still there today. I mean, you know, you can see it in recent work that's coming out, and you can see it when you know, Abdul Basit talks about his work on the manuscript. I mean, the manuscripts are just inherently exciting, right? And there's such a wealth, and this is the case for other parts of West Africa too. There's so much work that needs to be done to catalog and to process and to analyze these different manuscripts. But I do think a big consequence of that, you know, and this is, I have a quote, I think, to this effect from Hiskett in the paper, that the voices that come across, you know, in the history writing of that time, or especially the voices of the three, you know, top Fodiawa, and I think that gives a certain view of the caliphate experience, a positive one. Yeah.
Thank you. So we are almost at 1:30. Any last questions for Professor Thurston? As another one may come in, but I just want to remind you, stay with us, because we'll take a half-hour break, and at 2, we'll have another panel. This afternoon's panel is African Religious Movements and Democracies. If you need to register for that particular panel, please remember to register individually for each panel. That is also in the chat as well, if you would like to register for this afternoon's panel starting at 2, African Religious Movements and Democracies. There are some who we could not get to in terms of answering the question, but we know that panelists have been able to message directly to some who have asked questions, and please continue to do so, or connect offline if you wish. Any final questions before we wrap up? Okay, I think we are good. So thank you again so much to our wonderful panelists. This has been an extraordinary set of papers and discussion, and hopefully it will continue throughout the conference. So thank you so much, and please, I'm sure everyone's ready for lunch or dinner or breakfast, depending on where you are, and please join us in a half hour at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you so much, and be well.